them sufficient foreign currency to spend a very comfortable, if not luxurious, week in Paris. I flew them to Paris, and I was with them at the opening of the exhibition. It was quite clear that the two pavilions that attracted most interest were those of Germany and Russia, which vied with each other. On our return to Berlin, we all had to report in great detail to Hitler concerning everything we had seen and give him our general impressions. He keenly regretted that his position had prevented him from going in person. It was often impossible for Hitler to do what he would have liked to do. In the summer months, he would usually walk in the garden of the Reich Chancellery on Sundays, and frequently I was his only companion. One day I asked him outright whether he didn't find it a bit boring always to be on his own, except for me or an adjutant, when, outside, every door stood open to him. "Baur," he replied earnestly, "I know that every door is open to me, but the fact is that where I'd really like to go, I can't go any more. Whilst the places where I could go, I don't want to go. You see, when I do go as a guest somewhere, it isn't long before my hostess asks me for some favour or other. As her guest, it isn't easy for me to refuse whatever it is she wants, but very often my conscience makes me. So on the whole, I prefer not to put myself in such embarrassing situations in the first place." He was silent for a moment or two, and then he went on. "Now there's one place in particular I'd like to go to again, but I can't now. During the early days of my struggle, I lived with an old woman in Munich who had a small stall in the market. When I came home in the evenings, she would be at her sewing machine, and she always wanted to know whether I'd had any supper. Very often I hadn't, and then she'd get up and find me some thing, a glass of beer and some bread and cheese, or something of the sort. 'I know you mean well,' she used to say, 'but you ought to give up all that politics business and get yourself a job, and then you'd be able to eat properly.' Very often I wouldn't even be able to pay her the rent on time, but she'd still give me something to eat. Now that's someone I'd very much like to go and visit again, but as Reich Chancellor I can't." It was typical of Hitler that he was always impulsive and would do a thing immediately it came into his mind, and now he sent for his adjutant Bruckner. "I've just been telling Baur about an old woman who was kind to me years ago when she let me a room in Munich. I expect she's an old-age pensioner by this time, if she's still alive. I want you to find out about her and arrange for her to have a modest allowance." Hitler was essentially a man of simple tastes, and he disliked luxury and show. I remember when Göring Suddenly presented him with a new plane for his private use, a Ju-52. It had been built according to Göring's special instructions. Hitler and I inspected it together. It was luxuriously equipped, and it had every possible comfort. For example, all the seats were upholstered in green suede. "Wonderful, Göring, wonderful, very beautiful indeed," exclaimed Hitler, winking surreptitiously at me. Afterwards, when we were alone, he said, "Now that machine would suit Göring very well, but it doesn't suit me. I don't care for that sort of thing. We'll stick to the old, simple, well-made things. What would my friends think if I started flying around in a luxuriously equipped plane like that? No, Baur, don't you let anyone mislead you into doing anything of that sort. It isn't my style at all." Whilst we were in Munich one day, Esser appeared and asked Hitler on behalf of Dr. Dornier, the constructor of the famous flying boat Do X, to make a flight in it. As I have already recorded, Hitler had previously inspected the gigantic machine in Warnemünde, and he had not been greatly taken with it. "I haven't much time," he answered, and then he turned to me. "What do you think about it, Baur? Is it all right? Can you fly safely in a thing like that?" I replied that in my opinion there was nothing to fear, and that really he might do Dr. Dornier the honour, upon which he seemed reassured and agreed to make a short flight. They were flying around overhead for a good hour, and I took advantage of the situation to rush home. Incidentally, this absolute trust Hitler had in me as a pilot was always a little awkward when I wanted a whole-eye day, which I usually took in the winter months, when there wasn't so much air travel going on, and when I could enjoy my favourite sport, skiing. I always had to ask for leave 2 or 3 times before I finally got it, and then he would always try to make me promise not to go skiing because he thought it was too dangerous. When I would point out to him that as a good Bavarian I had skied since I was a little boy and could really be regarded as quite good at it, he would say, "That's all very well, Baur, but even the most experienced skier can meet with an accident. I don't want you laid up for weeks, and perhaps even months, with broken bones." But that was one point on which I wouldn't give way, and it was always he who had to. And so for a couple of weeks I would get out into my beloved mountains and ski to my heart's content in preparation for the new owner. Our round of duties that would be awaiting me when I returned. At the end of Hitler's successful flight with the Dum-X, Dr. Dornier invited him to fly with the machine to Pass, so the next day, where he proposed to come down on the reservoir of the Kashlet power station. But this Hitler refused to do, pleading that he was overburdened with work. Dr. Dornier made the trip with Major Heiler, and on setting down, something went wrong. The tail of the Dum-X was torn off, and everyone got a bad shaking and a thorough soaking. Probably the pilot had set the Dum-X down at too steep an angle. "You see, Baur," declared Hitler, "I was right. I just had a feeling in my bones that there was something wrong with that monstrous thing." On 19th of June 1937, I was 40 years old, and Kannenberg was given special instructions by Hitler to prepare my favourite dinner, roast pork with potato dumplings. Now Hitler was, of course, a vegetarian, and how he came to know about my non-vegetarian fancies was rather funny. "Baur," he said one day, "you know the best thing for you would be vegetarian food such as I eat. It soothes the nerves and it's very good for you. You really ought to become a vegetarian. You'd be very healthy." "I'm already very healthy," I replied, "and my nerves are all right too. And I'll tell you something else. I'm not one of those hypocrites who come here and eat a vegetarian meal with you and then go over afterwards to Kannenberg and have a proper meal. I'd sooner have one good meal of roast pork with potato dumplings than all the nut cutlets in the world. You'll never make me a vegetarian." Hitler laughed at my forthrightness and my determination to stay a meat-eater, and after that Kannenberg received orders always to have roast pork and potato dumplings ready for me on my birthday. On this particular birthday, when Hitler had congratulated me, he added his warm thanks for having flown him safely for 6 years. Herr Verlin, the general director of the Mercedes Works, was with us at table that day, but I thought nothing of it. Hitler was finished first, as he always was, because he ate less than anyone else. As soon as I had finished, he excused himself to the others who were still eating, saying that he couldn't wait any longer to show me my birthday present, and getting up from the table he led me through the conservatory and out into the garden. I was wondering what sort of a present he was going to give me. Perhaps something for the garden of the new house he had recently built for me? But when we got outside, standing there on the gravel path was a wonderful Mercedes limousine. It was my birthday present, and at first I stared at it, almost open-mouthed. When I recovered sufficiently to thank him, he told me how it had come about. He had first discussed post-Sibyl presents with his intimate circle, Bormann and the others, but none of their suggestions had pleased him, and then he had his own idea. From the airfield at Munich to my house at Pilsensee was about an hour's drive, and one day he got the idea of following me in his own car without my knowing it, in order, as he said, to find out whether I drove like a madman, as, according to him, most flyers did. Well, I didn't. I have as much respect for my bones on the ground as in the air. But what he had noticed was that I drove an American car, a Ford, and he didn't think that right for his flight captain, hence the Mercedes. I got permission from him to drive it to Munich that night. I was tremendously pleased with it, and when I got home to my wife and family, I couldn't help thinking that I was a pretty lucky man. My wife and I agreed that with this grand car we had most things we wanted. If I had another wish, it was just that it should always stay that way. But that was obviously too much to ask. I drove that car to the end of the war, and then the Americans confiscated it and I never saw it again. But, by then, that was the least of my troubles. Hitler was invited to pay a visit to the Italian court as the personal guest of the King of Italy. Unfortunately, the meteorological reports were very unfavourable, so Hitler decided to go to Rome by special train. I was to lead a flight of 3 condors. In Rome, I put up at the hotel I had always used there, the Massimi d'Aceglio. I had stayed there on innumerable occasions as flight captain of the Lufthansa, and its Bavarian proprietor, Herr Kiesel, had become my very good friend. I then reported my arrival to Hitler, who had been given a suite of rooms in the Quirinal. The first thing he said to me after his greeting was, "Just imagine it, Baur. As soon as I got out of the station, which incidentally had been built specially for him and was like a bower of flowers, what should I find but prehistoric animals to drag me away in an antediluvian state coach? What a conveyance for a modern man. But there you are, Baur, that's the royal tradition, so I had to put up with it. But I didn't feel comfortable, I can tell you." The reception they had prepared for Hitler was tremendous, and must have cost a pretty penny. At the parade the next day, I noticed that Hitler spoke a good deal to Mussolini, and hardly more to the king than politeness required. Incidentally, he said more than once that he regarded the king as a hindrance to Mussolini and an obstacle to the carrying out of his plans. This time, the march past of the Italian fascist organizations was distinctly better. They had obviously been in stricter training in the meantime. As a flyer, I was of course interested in what the Italian Air Force had to show us. Big stands had been erected in Furborough facing the sea, and everyone who was anyone in Rome was there. The aerobatics the Italian flyers showed us were first class, and I was particularly impressed by their formation flights. Then came bombing demonstrations. Medium bombers dropped small bombs on land objectives, and the aiming was fairly good. Then heavy bombers attacked 2 ships out at Sierre in full view and sank both of them, or appeared to, for I heard it whispered afterwards that they had really been sunk by charges electrically detonated from the shore, though I can't say anything one way or the other about that. It looked good, and on the whole, the performance of the Italians in the air was quite impressive. That evening we attended an open-air performance of Ada in the Mussolini Forum. Hundreds of actors and actresses took part in it, and once again Italy's leading opera singers gave us their best. Altogether, it was a very enjoyable evening. The next afternoon there was a state banquet given in Hitler's honour. I was waiting in the anteroom together with about 200 other guests for the arrival of the King and Queen and the guest of honour, Hitler. After a while, 2 great doors were opened and a chamberlain announced the imminent arrival of Her Majesty the Queen of Italy and Herr Hitler, Chancellor of the German Reich. The 2 high personages appeared, the Queen, a big, handsome woman, on Hitler's arm. As they entered the hall, all the Italians bowed low. Some of them even went down on their knees, and as the 2 passed through a narrow lane between the waiting guests, many of them took the Queen's gown and kissed it. Hitler was obviously highly embarrassed by the whole busyness, the low bowing, the kneeling and the kissing of the Queen's hem. With a flushed face, he almost dragged her along so as to get it over as quickly as possible. We thought he was going to have a stroke, but he managed to get the Queen through to the hall where the banquet was to take place. I referred to it that evening when we were alone, and he said, "Baur, it was terrible. These court ceremonies. Find out whether I drove like a madman, as, according to him, most flyers did. Well, I didn't. I have as much respect for my bones on the ground as in the air. But what he had noticed was that I drove an American car, a Ford, and he didn't think that right for his flight captain, hence the Mercedes. I got permission from him to drive it to Munich that night. I was tremendously pleased with it, and when I got home to my wife and family, I couldn't help thinking that I was a pretty lucky man. My wife and I agreed that with this grand car we had most things we wanted. If I had another wish, it was just that it should always stay that way. But that was obviously too much to ask. I drove that car to the end of the war, and then the Americans confiscated it, and I never saw it again, but by then, that was the least of my troubles. Hitler was invited to pay a visit to the Italian court as the personal guest of the King of Italy. Unfortunately, the meteorological reports were very unfavourable, so Hitler decided to go to Rome by special train. I was to lead a flight of 3 condors. In Rome, I put up at the hotel I had always used there, the Massimi d'Aciglio. I had stayed there on innumerable occasions as flight captain of the Lufthansa, and its Bavarian proprietor, Herr Kiesel, had become my very good friend. I then reported my arrival to Hitler, who had been given a suite of rooms in the Quirinal. The first thing he said to me after his greeting was, "Just imagine it, Baur. As soon as I got out of the station, which, incidentally, had been built specially for him and was like a bower of flowers, what should I find but prehistoric animals to drag me away in an antediluvian state coach? What a conveyance for a modern man. But there you are, Baur. That's the royal tradition, so I had to put up with it. But I didn't feel comfortable, I can tell you." The reception they had prepared for Hitler was tremendous, and must have cost a pretty penny. At the parade the next day, I noticed that Hitler spoke a good deal to Mussolini, and hardly more to the king than politeness required. Incidentally, he said more than once that he regarded the king as a hindrance to Mussolini, and an obstacle to the carrying out of his plans. This time the march past of the Italian fascist organizations was distinctly better. They had obviously been in stricter training in the meantime. As a flyer, I was of course interested in what the Italian Air Force had to show us. Big stands had been erected in Furbara facing the sea, and everyone who was anyone in Rome was there. The aerobatics the Italian flyers showed us were first class, and I was particularly impressed by their formation flights. Then came bombing demonstrations. Medium bombers dropped small bombs on land objectives, and the aiming was fairly good. Then heavy bombers attacked 2 ships out at sea in full view and sank both of them, or appeared to, for I heard it whispered afterwards that they had really been sunk by charges electrically detonated from the shore, though I can't say anything one way or the other about that. It looked good, and on the whole, the performance of the Italians in the air was quite impressive. That evening we attended an open-air performance of Aida in the Mussolini Forum. Hundreds of actors and actresses took part in it, and once again Italy's leading opera singers gave us their best. Altogether it was a very enjoyable evening. The next afternoon there was a state banquet given in Hitler's honour. I was waiting in the anteroom together with about 200 other guests for the arrival of the King and Queen and the guest of honour, Hitler. After a while, 2 great doors were opened, and a chamberlain announced the imminent arrival of Her Majesty the Queen of Italy and Herr Hitler, Chancellor of the German Reich. The 2 high personages appeared, the Queen, a big, handsome woman on Hitler's arm. As they entered the hall, all the Italians bowed low. Some of them even went down on their knees. And as the 2 passed through a narrow lane between the waiting guests, many of them took the Queen's gown and kissed it. Hitler was obviously highly embarrassed by the whole busyness, the low bowing, the kneeling and the kissing of the Queen's hem. With a flushed face, he almost dragged her along so as to get it over as quickly as possible. We thought he was going to have a stroke, but he managed to get the Queen through to the hall where the banquet was to take place. I referred to it that evening when we were alone, and he said, "Baur, it was terrible. These court ceremonies upset me. I shall never get used to them. When I saw those Italians on the ground, I thought it so humiliating that the only thing I could do was to get it over as quickly as possible." He loathed all such obsequious ceremonies. During the visit, Mussolini showed his fleet in Naples, and Hitler was certainly very much impressed by that, particularly by about 80 or 90 submarines which submerged and surfaced in formation with extraordinary accuracy. After that, Italian tanks did firing exercises with live shells, but Hitler was not particularly impressed by their performance. That evening, deputations arrived in costume from all the Italian provinces and performed their local dances. This otherwise pleasant evening was spoiled for Hitler by his annoyance at the way Mussolini was kept in the background by the king. And several times, pretending that there was something he wanted to say to him, Hitler took Mussolini by the arm and led him to the front with the king and queen. Quite generally, Hitler did not care much for the Italian royal family, and this was particularly true of the Crown Prince Umberto. In the summer of 1938, the Crown Prince and Princess were invited to Berlin, and Hitler instructed me to fly them back to Milan afterwards. As we flew over the Alps, I kept them informed the whole time of our position and height, and I pointed out each important peak and valley, for I knew the Alps like the palm of my hand. We landed without incident on Taliedo airfield near Milan, and both my passengers thanked me warmly for having made their flight so interesting. A few weeks later, through the Italian embassy in Berlin, I received an inscribed photograph of the royal pair in a silver frame. When I reported back to Hitler that I had flown his guests safely to Milan, he nodded, and then said that he was sorry for the poor woman. She must have a good deal to put up with, and the marriage didn't seem to be a happy one. Now that there was a proper German army again, based on compulsory military service, instead of the small Reichswehr, Hitler was often at Krupp's in Essen for discussions on various armament questions, and the latest weapons were always demonstrated to him. After such visits, we usually went on to Bad Godesberg, where Hitler would stay, as always, in the Hotel Driessen. That evening, a big Rhine salmon, which we were shown still alive, was prepared for our dinner. It weighed over 50 pounds, and I for one was looking forward to it. We were all in the dining room, actually, with our hands on the backs of the chairs, preparatory to sitting down as soon as Hitler did, when von Puttkamer, Hitler's naval attaché, was called to the telephone. Hitler immediately declared that we would wait until he returned before sitting down to dinner. But when von Puttkamer did return, it was to inform Hitler that Admiral Raeder wished to speak to him. This in itself was unusual. It was very seldom that anyone asked for Hitler to be called to the telephone. Whatever it was obviously a matter of some importance, and in the meantime that gigantic Rhine salmon had to wait. After about 10 minutes, Hitler reappeared and strode up to me at once. "Baur, what is the earliest possible moment we can start for Berlin?" he demanded. Actually, we took off at 21-hour hours, and I flew him to Berlin on an empty stomach, mine in particular. He didn't mind so much. The Spanish Civil War was going on at the time, and apparently the German battleship Deutschland had been fired on. A number of sailors had been killed and wounded. We landed in Berlin at 23 early hours, and half an hour later I arrived in Hitler's apartment in the Reich Chancellery. He was waiting for the morning papers, which were always brought to him as soon as they came off the press. As I came in, he had the first of them in his hands. "Hallo, Baur," he greeted me. "You here already?" "Yes," I said. "I am, and I'm starving." "Well, go into the restaurant and get a meal." I did so, and after a while he joined me. "The Russians have fired on the Deutschland," he said, "and I've had to act quickly to prevent such things from happening again. You see, Baur, how important it is that I should keep you always with me. You never know what's going to happen next. Because we were able to get to Berlin quickly, I was able to settle everything immediately, and things are already moving. What a terrible loss of time it would have been if I'd had to take a special train to Berlin." It appeared that as a reprisal for the bombardment of the Deutschland, Hitler had ordered the bombardment of the Spanish coastal town of Almeria. He declared that it would just have been a waste of time to use diplomatic channels. The only thing to do was to act, and act quickly. The German warship nearest to Almeria would open the bombardment at dawn the next day. Hitler had discussed the matter with the naval authorities, and was quite convinced that he had acted correctly. A few days later, he returned to the subject and told me that the foreign press had remained relatively calm in face of the German reprisals, and that no one had even seriously disputed his right to act as he had done. In the first few days of March, the newspapers sold like hotcakes all over Germany, because there was great excitement on account of the situation in Austria, on whose frontiers German troops were massed. On the 12th of March at 08:10, we took off from Berlin and landed in Munich at 10:30. That morning, German troops had already crossed the border into Austria, and Hitler now followed them by road. I flew to Vienna and reported to the Hotel Imperial, where Hitler had already made his headquarters. Early on 13th of March, Cardinal Initzer came to see him. There was a tremendous mass of people gathered in front of the hotel when the car containing the Cardinal and his retinue drove up. Hitler had a suite on the first floor, and I and others stood on the landing to see how Hitler would receive the Cardinal. Hitler went to the door to meet him and bowed deeply, a thing I had never seen him do before. The meeting was polite, and Cardinal Initzer seemed determined to keep the interview agreeably. When their discussion was over, they parted on obviously friendly terms. Hitler was clearly satisfied with the upshot of the discussion, and he declared gleefully that he had succeeded in ensuring peace between church and state in Austria. He had given certain assurances, and Cardinal Initzer had deemed them adequate. Thus, although Hitler's arrival in Austria was not desired by the church, it was not positively opposed. In the afternoon, great demonstrations took place in the Burgarten, and the enthusiasm of the masses was indescribable. Hitler had a number of meetings with various other prominent personalities in Austria, and then we flew back to Berlin. The Czech crisis boiled up next, and there was once again great excitement in Germany. We could sense that everything was at stake, and that at any moment the die could fall. I flew Hitler to Godesberg, where he was to meet the British Premier Chamberlain. In the Hotel Driessen there is a smaller room off the entrance hall, and you can see into it through a glass door. It was here that Hitler and Chamberlain had their discussion, whilst we all stood outside as spectators. It was like looking at a silent film, but without titles to help you. We could see the two statesmen talking and see their gestures, but only guess at what they were saying. They greeted each other politely. Then the discussion began, and during the course of it a map was produced and laid out on the table. It was from this moment on that the discussion began to get lively, and it was quite easy to see that Chamberlain was not at all in agreement with Hitler's proposals. But Hitler went on talking uninterruptedly, gesticulating again and again to the map. We could see that he was speaking very energetically. From what we could judge of the business, it didn't look as though the discussions were going to lead to any agreement. The next morning Chamberlain didn't turn up at all, and let Hitler know that he was indisposed. Hitler immediately offered him his own physician, Dr. Morel, but although he was thanked for this kind offer, it was refused. In the afternoon, Chamberlain came down from where he was staying on the Petersburg, and the discus scions were resumed. It is now a matter of history that they ended in the famous Munich Agreement. Hitler was delighted, and he kept telling us what clever politicians and diplomats the English were. His discussions with Chamberlain had made him more than ever determined to press on with his favourite plan to win both Britain and Italy as friends of Germany. One thing he said again and again was, "If we can get an alliance with both the British and the Italians, then we can arrange matters in our own Reich just as we please." And whenever he had British visitors, he was never tired of stressing that if only Britain would leave him a free hand in Europe, she need not fear that he would do anything whatever to weaken her world position. No doubt the naval agreement, the many discussions with leading British politicians, and a number of steps taken through mediators were all designed to bring about the same consummation. And Hitler stressed in particular that he had no ambition for Germany to possess the strongest navy. All he wanted was sufficient naval strength to defend her shores and keep open the routes to her colonies, which he hoped that Britain would soon return. During discussions at table too, Hitler often expressed his admiration of British international diplomacy, and the idea of friendship with Britain cropped up again and again as a sort of sheet anchor in his conversation. For my part, I believe that he was perfectly sincere in this desire. Later on, of course, Hitler had to abandon these ideas, and today there is not much point in speculating as to what might have happened if he had succeeded in establishing the friendly relationship which he so much desired. It is enough to say that a good many things would be different now. The unfortunate truth seems to be that when you have two big powers, both anxious to play a leading role in the world, their interests collide at so many points that any fundamental agreement for joint action is impossible. Aren't we witnessing the same thing all over again? Soon after the occupation of Austria, Hitler began to talk about the way in which Czech territory drove like a wedge into the new German Reich, and to say that something must be done about it. After a certain amount of preliminary negotiation, Hitler sent for the president of the Czechoslovak Republic, Hácha. When Hácha, an undistinguished and rather pathetic little man, arrived in Berlin, he gave every sign of being very ill at ease, knowing no doubt that the negotiations between him and Hitler were going to be very difficult. Hitler wasted no time, but immediately demanded that Hacha should agree to the incorporation of the Czech Republic into the German Reich. At first, Hacha desperately refused to agree, but when he saw that Hitler was quite determined and that resistance would only mean useless bloodshed, he surrendered. When it was all over, he had a seizure, and Morel, Hitler's personal physician, gave him several injections. Morel told me afterwards that he had been afraid Hacha would die on the spot. Fortunately, he recovered sufficiently to be able to leave the Reich Chancellery. German troops were already concentrated on the Czech frontiers, and Hitler now gave orders for the invasion. He then boarded a special train so as to be with his troops in Prague, if possible even before Hacha got back. I was to fly to Prague to be on hand for further instructions. When I touched down on Prague airfield, Hitler was already in the Hradčin, the ancient castle on a hill overlooking Prague, which was the seat of the Czechoslovak government. When we arrived, Hitler explained the historic role which the Hradčin had played in German history and declared that it was now to play that role again. The Czechs had hastily evacuated the Hradčin, and there was very little furniture left. The staff had gone too. German personnel soon got the kitchens going and provisionally put the great dining hall in order. After the formalities connected with the formal incorporation of the Czech Republic into the Third Reich, Hitler flew back to Berlin. The German Labour Front under Ley had built a couple of 26,000-ton vessels for its Strength Through Joy movement to serve as holiday ships. Ley himself had several times asked Hitler to come on board for a cruise, and Hitler had always refused on account of pressure of work. Now he agreed, and I flew him to Bremerhaven, where he boarded one of these vessels, the Robert Ley, which was about to make her maiden voyage with 1,000 passengers on board. Hitler inspected the whole vessel, which was splendidly equipped with several big dining rooms, gymnasiums, auditoriums, dance halls, swimming baths, a library and fine promenade decks. On the way to Heligoland, we were escorted by 2 fast destroyers, and at one time a submarine surfaced near us, the crew tumbling out of the hatchways and lining up on deck to greet us. When we were on Heligoland, Hitler's chief interest was in the deep excavation work which was being carried out to fortify the island and install big naval guns. And this was typical of the shadow that was now rising over us all. When I look back at my life, I can see that by this time I had already had my heyday. I had been privileged to play an active part in the beginnings of flying, and I had done my share to help build it up to what it had already become by that time. The old kites we had flown in the beginning had now given way to masterpieces of technical ingenuity, and my comrades were flying passengers over dozens of routes which linked up all big towns and all important countries, and even continents. Our Lufthansa had already earned the highest possible reputation in the world. All in all, therefore, I think we had every right to be proud and satisfied, for the development of civil flying from the first post-war years until 1939 had been truly enormous. We were airmen, though, not politicians, and we thought Germany was enjoying a period of great constructive progress. But a change was taking place. Flying was being pressed into the service of war. Its aim was no longer to carry passengers and freight quickly and safely, but to carry and drop as big a weight of bombs as possible. Flying fortresses were what was wanted now, not fast and comfortable passenger planes. In the meantime, we continued to fly. We could not see the whole game, and we went on flying until, with the outbreak of the Second World War, the whole character of flying changed.